Hello, everyone, and welcome to a live Q&A on American thought leaders with our White House reporter and also, of course, our expert on finance, Emel Akan. Emel, so good to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Hello, Jan. Hello, everyone. And hello from Washington, D.C. And thanks for having me.
Well, Emel, we're going to talk about some very, very serious things today. I think many of our viewers saw that one of the major topics of this discussion is going to be how Americans fund the CCP or the Chinese Communist Party. And that seems to be like a kind of a big thing to say, that Americans are doing that. For some people, it might be obvious, but for others, it sounds kind of shocking. And they might want to know, show me the evidence. So for starters, how does this even happen?
So this problem has been going on for more than a decade. And so American investors are unknowingly investing in these Chinese companies. And some of these companies are helping the China's military, PLA, and some of them are basically helping the government in its persecution of groups. They're helping in, these in so-called concentration camps, in the genocide, in other human rights abuses. So the way we do is that we opened up the capital markets to Chinese companies so they can list in these, in the U.S. stock exchanges. And also we have another door, which is basically through index and passive managed funds, where most of these funds are holding Chinese companies, listed Chinese companies, public ones. And so the American investors are indirectly and without knowing investing in these companies and basically funding these operations in China.
Well, so let's dig into all this. I mean, it's amazing actually when you say it like this, because there's so many kind of sort of routes through which this sort of thing actually happens, and it seems to be like there's still investors and some of these index funds that are very, very excited to pump billions of dollars more money into China and indirectly and sometimes directly into the CCP. So for starters, there's actually been this ban recently that has been ordered by the White House of 59 Chinese defense and tech firms. Tell me about this. Is this something that actually is going to help?
Yes, I think that what we saw on Thursday last week is a step by the Biden administration. It's the continuation of the policy that was implemented during Trump's presidency. This has been going on for a year, actually, the steps and crackdown on investments in Chinese companies. And last year, just to remind everyone, in November, President Trump declared a national emergency, said that investing in these companies, he called them communist Chinese military companies, investing in these companies are banned. And basically what they did is to give a certain period for U.S. investors to divest from these companies. And during that time, the Pentagon listed 44 companies that were so-called, Chinese military companies. So that was the executive order. With the Biden administration, the fear was that he would reverse these rules, but he did the opposite, which was very welcome news for many people in the national security and human rights advocates. And so what he did is expanded. So basically, he continued this national emergency situation. He said that this is important for the U.S., United States national security. And he basically expanded the list, included about 59, as you said, 59 companies in this list. And he basically changed the term, saying that these will include China's defense companies and China's surveillance technology providers. So basically the list is going to be provided by the Treasury Department, updated by the Treasury Department. And so Americans the ban starts in August, just to give you an idea what it is like. And the divestment process will be within a year. So by June next year, you won't be able to sell or buy these companies. So American investors have to get rid of these companies from their portfolios.
Now, okay, so, and this is all dealing with basically public companies that you're talking about. And the other question is, are there more companies than these 59 that we should be looking at?
Certainly, I think there are different lists, Jan, and it's very confusing. So I just want to remind everyone, this is going to be, the authority is transferred to the Treasury Department. In the Trump administration order, it was the selection process would be done by the Pentagon. So this is a bit changed, but it's okay. But so the Pentagon has a list. They will be putting out list of these military companies, but the Treasury Department will have its own list, as far as I know now, with the executive order. And then we have Commerce Department list, which is entity list, which basically bans technology transfer to Chinese companies. So I would say that maybe over time they will merge these lists, or they will expand the list of, investment ban lists. But certainly there are, I think, companies outside of this 59, and the Treasury Department will be responsible of expanding this list.
So it's kind of actually confusing to figure out, who's being sanctioned, in what way, what is it that you can do and you can't do with them? Is there an outright ban on investment? That's bizarre to me.
It is actually, but also I think with this executive order, many things were clarified. Initially, the order during Trump's administration was saying that you will also include the subsidiary. So that was a universe of maybe 100 companies. But you have to always remember that's only public companies. So you're not like talking about private companies. So sometimes people ask, why are these companies not in the investment ban list? Because it's not public. So this is only covering the companies that are listed on stock exchanges in the United States and overseas. So this is like a public company that is listed globally in anywhere. It could Shenzhen or Shanghai, exchange. It could be Hong Kong exchange or New York Stock Exchange. So this is the universe we're talking about. And of course, people were asking initially, will this cover ETFs, like exchange traded funds? Are the passively managed funds will be included in this? Yes. Eventually, you will see all these index providers dropping these companies from the list, so that the American investors are not exposed to them.
Emel, let's dig into this. Just even thinking about the idea that there's all these giant Chinese, including Chinese state companies, right? These are the companies that are directly under the Chinese Communist Party itself, that they're publicly listed and have huge valuations on U.S. exchanges. How did all this actually come about? I mean, again, for some people, you might be scratching their heads, like, what's going on here, right?
Yes, you're right. So the problem evolved over time. So we started with small companies first causing problems, and then you have like these big companies now, and almost all of them, I believe, are, helping the Chinese Communist Party, but they're obvious players like military companies that, that are subcontractors of military, right? So obvious. But I think it started all with the 2008 financial crisis after this Great Recession, with the opening up of economy of China. What they wanted is to take advantage of the U.S. capital markets. Why people come to the United States? It's a very important, fundraising place for companies, and it's a prestige to be listed in the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ. So what Chinese companies did initially, all these small companies or high growth companies, they wanted to raise capital, and the best place is coming to the United States. But instead of going through these initial public offering procedure, which is very hard, like you have to do a lot of things. It is a 1 year or more than a year process. You have to disclose many documents. So instead of doing that, they took an easy route, which is called reverse merger IPOs. And what they did is they started buying out the listed companies in the United States, American companies. So they basically bought out those companies, and they became automatically listed in the United States. So that happened between 2009, and hundreds of companies, Chinese companies, came. And I really recommend you watch this documentary. It's really a nice documentary. It's sad, but it's also funny in some ways, showing how these companies took advantage of the U.S. investors. And it's called China Hustle, Hustle, and it's a documentary. And it's then the main character in this is a real character who was involved in exposing these companies one by one, all these Chinese companies. He's a short seller, activist investor. And what he did is that he researched these companies. He found that some of these companies didn't even exist. It's on the paper. And he had researchers in China. They went to the factories, disclosed in the audit reports. They found out that these companies had actually no operations, and some of them even didn't exist. So these activist investors started exposing these companies, and these companies, of course, the share prices crashed immediately. And in just 3 years' time, all these hundreds of companies were exposed like these. And so U.S. Investors lost a lot of money because of that. Do we have this problem? Yes, I think we still have this problem. The problem really evolved. So you see more bigger companies, bigger players in the U.S. market. But as we saw last year with Luckin Coffee, which is the Starbucks of China, it did exactly the same thing. It manipulated the their accounting numbers. They inflated their sales number. And again, not auditors, and another activist investor wrote a detailed report about their accounting irregularities, the scandal. And after that, the price crashed. It lost 80% of value. NASDAQ delisted these companies, as in the past. I mean, people thought that U.S. government took action, but this is still happening. So the problem is you can't rely on their numbers. And secondly, they don't disclose all the risks to the U.S. investors. Like, they're working for the China's military, they're working for the Chinese regime, helping them with the human rights abuses. So these are all risks, and I just wanted to provide you some historical background.
I mean, this is absolutely fascinating. And in a moment, I'm going to get you to, kind of explain to me a little bit, because you mentioned that there actually isn't the same kind of auditing requirements or anything close to the same kind of auditing requirements that U.S. companies have to face on some of these Chinese companies, some of these, gigantic Chinese companies that are actually listed. So I'm going to get you to tell me about that in just one moment. Before we do that, I just wanted to remind everyone that we have our regularly scheduled American Thought Leaders episode coming up at 7 p.m. Eastern U.S. time this evening. It's actually with Dr. Nicole Saphier, and she's the author of COVID Panic. All right, this is a very, very interesting book, and she actually talks about all sorts of things in there, including quite a bit the Wuhan lab leak theory. And, in the book, which was written a little while ago, she was already saying, how can we dismiss this? This is, of course, plausible. And as everyone knows, this is something that we've finally, after, at the Epoch Times, we knew it was highly plausible over a year ago. Most of the rest of mainstream media are kind of catching up, and frankly, the rest of the world are catching up to understand that this is very much a plausible route about what happened with the virus. So that's coming up this evening, 7 p.m. Eastern U.S. time on American Thought Leaders, only, of course, on Epoch TV at epochtv.com. So jumping back to with you, Emel, again, this is something that, frankly, every time I think about it, you mentioned auditing, every time I think about it, I'm just kind of stunned by this idea, because U.S. companies have some pretty stringent auditing requirements, right? Pretty darn important things that they have to, not important, but like onerous things that they basically have to kind of prove their viability and everything else in order to be able to be listed and function normally in the U.S. system. But for some reason, even now, even after the China hustle in the late, or in the early 2010s, this Chinese companies don't seem to have the same requirements. And explain this to me. Explain how the requirements are different. And again, how did this happen?
It's a big problem, Jan. So U.S. regulators cannot inspect the audit papers of Chinese companies, and it's just unbelievable. Because if you are a foreign company, if you're coming to the United States for listing, you have to basically hire auditors, and you have, lawyers. They all go through this prospectus, and they list all the risks that you're. But basically, they're treated the same as the U.S. company, so you have to be very transparent. And you can't basically manipulate numbers. So you have to be very, you need to comply with the rules. And it takes 1 year to be listed. And after that, of course, every quarter you need to disclose your numbers, and they have to be audited. The problem is U.S. regulators have been always complaining that they cannot access the audit papers of Chinese companies. This is because Chinese regulators do not allow U.S. regulators to inspect them, and they are citing, national security reasons. They're saying this is, secrecy of the state, so it's against their state secrets. And so then one questions, why do you treat Chinese companies differently, right? I mean, this is just unbelievable to me. And this has been going on for years. And in 2013, I just want to, mention this. In 2013, the Chinese and U.S. regulators signed an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, which actually resolved this issue between these two regulators, and U.S. regulators provided a relaxed treatment for the Chinese companies, saying that if there's no if there's a conflict, we will just try to find out through consultation. So that means we were basically providing lax standards for Chinese companies. And so this is just unbelievable, and it has been going on for years.
Well, so again, I'm going to ask this because it's kind of a crazy question. Like, what requirements do they actually have in terms of, for example, opening their books to, Big Four auditors or whatnot?
Exactly. So basically, I'm originally from Turkey. So if a Turkish company wants to be listed in New York Stock Exchange, so they hire one of the auditors, right? Auditors are basically Big Four, one of the Big Four companies, and they have to disclose all their, financial statements accurately, and they have to basically disclose all the risks to the investors, all the operations. It's such a big, requirement that they have, and they have to comply with all these. And there's no special treatment to any country except for China and Hong Kong. So when you look at, if you go to the website of the U.S. regulator, which is Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, you go to the website, they list all the companies they cannot access, like they cannot audit. They say it publicly. And initially, when I looked at it, like last year, there were like Belgian companies, the French companies, but they were saying that they are in touch with the regulators in those countries to resolve their differences. And then I looked at it again, and they resolved those differences. So we only see Chinese and Hong Kong listed companies, in the U.S. And they cannot access and it's unbelievable because they're enlisted in the United States. You're basically not providing the same requirements, that you're not getting the same kind of audit or compliance from the Chinese companies, and it has been allowed.
Okay, so again, let me just get this straight. Okay, so we have a genocidal regime. It's officially a genocidal regime now. We know that truthfulness is certainly not a virtue of Chinese diplomats under the Chinese Communist Party, nor business leaders. And you're basically telling me right now that they really could just be making up these numbers, and that the actual official international auditors would have no way of really knowing that. And it takes some kinds of basically deep dive short sellers, people who are deeply financially invested in figuring it out, to actually, understand anything about these companies?
Even yes, you're right. And even Big Four companies, when they say that, they audited this Chinese company, they have a disclaimer saying that we only rely on the numbers provided by the company. And that is true for every company in the world. So you basically, the audit reports are not reliable. But beyond that, if U.S. regulators want to inspect these reports, they cannot inspect either. So yes, I mean, the audit reports could could mislead investors. They might not, provide the numbers accurately, but they only disclose and saying their responsibility is only to a certain level, because they rely on companies. They rely on companies, the information provided by the companies. If a company doesn't want to provide an information, then how would you know, right, as an investor? For example, I don't think all these, prospectuses of, investor prospectuses, when you're going public, you don't disclose that you're selling, a surveillance camera to the Chinese Communist Party so that they can conduct genocide, right? Do you do that? No, that doesn't exist at all. And the U.S. investors do not understand the real risk by investing in these companies.
So let me jump to some, user questions, and they're kind of quick ones here. One of them is, Emel, what is the documentary that you recommended? Can you just kind of highlight that again?
Sure, it's China Hustle, Hustle. It was done in, I think, 2018 or 19. It talks about this, the problem of Chinese companies deceiving U.S. investors.
And okay, another question. Does the Epoch Times accept WeChat Pay? And then there's an LOL following it. I'll let you answer that, Emel.
Well, it's a great question. I don't think so, but again, these companies are everywhere, operating everywhere, and U.S. investors do not know the real risk with these companies.
Well, with WeChat Pay, I mean, it's also a very poignant question in the context of this Chinese digital currency that the CCP is kind of many years into developing. And we just had an episode recently with Kyle Bass, the head of Heyman Capital, talking about the danger. He sees this Chinese digital currency as being, basically kind of an existential threat to the world. And so, imagine, WeChat Pay now basically connected to, the entirety of your transaction life and reality, and your entire social credit score, if you're familiar with that altogether. So no, we're not huge fans of WeChat Pay here at the Epoch Times. I have to be frank about that, because it's something that's basically directly tied to the Chinese regime, which seeks us ill. Now, Emel, let's jump to one more question. Will U.S. financial institutions like Chase and Amex be addressed here in our chat? That's an interesting question.
Well, investment banks are the players here, right? Helping Chinese companies. And then we have lawyers, the auditors, and then we have asset management companies. They're all, involved in the transaction, and they want the business from China because it's very profitable. They earn fees from the Chinese companies. So if a company wants to be listed in the U.S. stock exchange, or even Hong Kong Stock Exchange, they hire U.S. investment banks, right? And they pay large fees to these companies and lawyers as well. And so it's very profitable business. And we recently saw that asset management firms going to China because there's so much money there, right? And if there's an opening up of the China's financial markets. So it's always a great market for banking, for American bankers. And this is an important, of course, issue for Washington. And one of the things, I just want to say this, I don't know if it's relevant or not, but I just want to mention this. So what bankers are looking at is the policy. And last week, we heard from CEOs. They came to the House to testify. It was actually a virtual meeting, so they didn't come to Washington. But anyway, so in this virtual meeting, they were, of course, asked about their China operations. They were asked about, Taiwan. And one of the CEOs said, well, we are not foreign policy maker. You guys do the foreign policy, and we follow your foreign policy. So if you tell us not to do business in China, we will not do business in China. So that's what he said. He's partially right? Because that should come from the government. But there is also a big lobby group in Washington, and we know that. So it's hard sometimes. It takes time for Washington to make decisions. So again, this is like a big issue, and many financial firms are helping these Chinese companies.
So, another sort of headline recently. So there's been these different basically companies that have been on one of these three lists that you described, right? That are basically being sanctioned or banned in some way. So one of the companies that now has won a lawsuit in the US is Xiaomi, the Chinese cell phone maker, right? So this is, I think we were looking earlier, and it's something like $100 billion company. It's got like something like $3.5 billion of US investment in it. Interesting. And now, but more in general, right? what are the challenges with companies of this nature? Like, for example, a Chinese cell phone provider, basically having free reign to operate in America, which seems to be what this lawsuit is kind of going to allow, or at least at this point.
Yes. So Xiaomi, after the Trump's executive order, basically challenged this decision, saying that they're not military company, so that you have to be communist Chinese military company to be on that list. They said we're not tied to China's PLA, People's Liberation Army. So that's what they did, and it's amazing. Like Chinese company suing Chinese company suing U.S. government in U.S. courts, right? So they won the case just recently, and basically they are no longer in the list, the ban list. So U.S. investors can still invest in this company, Xiaomi. And I think Xiaomi is not listed in the U.S., so it's in Hong Kong, as far as I know. So they basically won't be under radar for unless they put this company back in the list. But as far as I know, this company is perceived as the next Huawei. I know that some lawmakers sent a letter to the administration saying that this company should be monitored carefully, and they asked some, questions about how they're taking care of that, and also they are saying that this company is, could be a threat to U.S. supply chain, communications and technology supply chain. So this is a company that is growing, and yes, and they won the case. And some people are asking me whether other companies could follow the same legal route, and challenge U.S. government. Yes, it's all possible. But I know that the Biden administration said that they will basically try to, review all these, challenges and try to, avoid them, because I think if they change the law, no one can challenge you, right? So that's probably what we are going to see.
Well, it's sort of interesting, whenever we talk about these things, I keep thinking about, what's called unrestricted warfare, what these, kind of PLA, the authors of the I guess, book on this topic, basically use of non-ostensibly military means to achieve military and, outcomes, so to speak. And so, we have these companies like Huawei, like Xiaomi, they obviously have an opportunity when they're operating in a country like the US to deeply embed themselves into the infrastructure, right, so to speak. And this is what a lot of people say causes the national security risk. I mean, to some extent, it's pretty obvious why this is sort of questionable. At the same time, this using the courts is another way, right? That's the legal warfare, another form of asymmetric warfare that the Chinese Communist Party uses. And then at the same time, of course, there's the sort of the media warfare, which is to basically, put all sorts of, positive sounding information in various media, especially investment media, to get, drum up a lot of U.S. money. How much U.S. money is, actually, let me ask this question a bit differently. We know there's been a ton of U.S. money coming through Wall Street, coming through these index funds, which I want to get you to tell me a little bit about how that's looking. And we've heard that some of this should be stopping because of these, these entity lists, the DoD lists, and so forth. That should be stopping. Has that actually happened? What is the trajectory, and how sharp is that trajectory?
So with these, investment bans, we started to see some action taken, and so some funds have dropped their, exposure to these Chinese companies. But the thing is still going on. So the rule has changed because people were waiting for the Biden administration to make a decision about the Trump executive order, and now it's public. And I think we will see more, drops in companies. So what we will see. Starting with the 59 companies, right, in the list of the Treasury, we will start to see they will be delisted from the American exchanges, and we already started to see that with China Mobile, China Telecom, which were the biggest receivers of the U.S. fund, and then some, I think, 2 or more companies. So these companies were basically delisted, and some are in the process of being delisted from the U.S. And then we have some index providers saying that we will be, what we will do is to basically drop, we are reviewing, and so we will drop these companies from our indexes, so emerging market indexes or, global indexes. So the funds won't be able to invest in these companies. And some fund managers are also actively, taking steps and saying that they're not going to invest. So they have to divest anyway in 1 year's time. So I hear from people that, many people in the Silicon Valley and, Wall Street, talking about Chinese companies is not cool anymore. It's like if you receive money from Huawei, it's not a great thing to say, right? So it's not cool anymore because of the public pressure. And what we will see is basically the investments going down for these companies. And just if you want, I can explain how companies are invested in through index funds. Would you like to learn about that? Because I don't know if people really understand how MSCI play a great role in this, investment process.
Absolutely. I'm going to get you to tell me about that in just a moment. I just wanted to quickly take a moment to remind everyone that we do have this episode with Dr. Nicole Saphier, the author of COVID Panic. It's coming up at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on American Thought Leaders on epochtv.com. That's where we do all of our main American Thought Leaders episodes these days. I want to invite you for that. It's a really fascinating discussion where we really also dig into the Wuhan lab leak theory and some of the research that was actually being done at that Wuhan lab that's been kind of in the news all over the place. So please join us for that in just over an hour. And at the same time, I also wanted to remind everyone that on Epoch TV we have this new documentary titled DeSantis, Florida versus Lockdowns. It's been getting we've been kind of humbled on American Thought Leaders. It's been getting rave reviews. It's basically looking at the governor's I guess you would say his governance style through the eyes of the ways he dealt with coronavirus, his response to coronavirus. It's quite a fascinating story. And again, it's there on epochtv.com. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe and join us. So
fear is very powerful, and they bought into it because it was temporary.
For the younger populations, the lockdown is way more harmful than COVID.
I got an email from someone who said, "Dear Dr. Atlas, thank you for everything that you've been saying. I'm writing you today because my husband killed himself."
What's going on here?
When push came to shove, they advocated policies that have not worked against the virus, but have been very, very destructive.
This is not an inconvenience. This is a matter of life and death.
Within 24 hours, we informed the governor, and immediately the governor said, "Make it happen."
He's showing the public what his advisors are telling him.
He looked at the science, he looked at the data.
The lockdowns were really a departure from what the typical scientific recommendations had been for pandemics.
The American spirit, the independent American, where are these people?
This is bad for our country. Every single fact that I discussed was edited out. These union thugs would come and try to break up some of my press conferences. If you had been infected, then you...
But the decisions that he made are not just impulsive.
He knows what he wants to do. He wants to do the right things.
I think Governor DeSantis was a big part of that.
I don't mind people swinging at me. A leader is elected to lead. I'd rather them beat up on me than have someone lose their job.
This is an enormous tragedy.
Now, Google, YouTube has not been, throughout this pandemic, repositories of truth and scientific inquiry.
He doesn't back down from a challenge.
They're never going to admit they were wrong.
Yeah, so I hope you get a chance to see the entire documentary, DeSantis, Florida versus Lockdowns. We just watched the trailer. So Emel, let's jump to these index funds and this sort of what you describe as passive investment. into some of these same companies and complicit in basically extreme human rights violations, potentially genocide, surveillance, technology, national security threats, and so on?
So there are two things here. One is you have companies here listed in the United States. Okay, so that's one. And then you have companies outside US, in other stock exchanges traded. So Americans can invest in the companies that are trading in other stock exchanges through index funds, through other their hedge funds and or mutual funds. And the way it works is that in the past these index providers. So most of the time, when you invest in emerging markets or global index, the fund managers do not really actively manage these funds because it requires a lot of research and a lot of time to pick companies. So what they do, they rely on index providers. So there are market index providers like MSCI, FTSE, or Barclays Global. So these companies do provide indexes. They have like global indexes. They have emerging market indexes. What China did a few years ago, basically put pressure on these index providers. And we have a report from Wall Street Journal that said that China put pressure on MSCI, otherwise it would limit the activities of the company. That's according to that report. And because of that, MSCI had to increase China weighting in the indexes. So what you do is, as an index provider, you add more Chinese companies. So what they did is they added more Chinese companies. So the China's weighting increased from, I don't know, like some numbers show 5%, 20%, and now we're like at almost 40% level. So if you were investing in emerging market index, the 40%, roughly 40% of them is composed of China stocks. So why these index providers are important? Because if you are passively managing a fund, you rely on index providers. So you track them, and as a fund manager, so you basically replicate the stocks that are in the index. So that's how you invest as a fund. So these are crucial issues, and these companies have been increasing the China weighting for the past 2-3 years. And so billions of dollars was transferred to these Chinese companies through this, weighting increase.
And so has this changed at all over the last couple of years? I know there has been, I remember a little while ago, there was discussion of how, the thrift savings plan, the military retirement fund was basically investing in some of these, very, very problematic Chinese companies through indirectly, basically, because through using these index fund ratings. Is there any change in this now? So
yes, with this ban, if a fund is tracking and ETF is tracking an index, and if it includes these banned companies, they won't be able to invest in these companies or in these ETFs. Have to divest. So this is a good step. So they won't be exposed to these Chinese companies, but that is only for those that are in the ban list. And I know that during Trump's administration, and the federal government retirement system basically was banned from investing in Chinese companies. But we know that, I think California and New York teachers investment funds are still investing in these Chinese companies. But if they are exposed to these Chinese companies now through index funds, I think that problem is being removed with the new ban, with the new executive order. Again, we're talking about 59 companies. So outside that, companies, funds would be still able to invest in Chinese stocks.
Is it possible for a company to be independent in China? How does that look?
It's a great question. When somebody was saying, aren't all companies working for the CCP in China? So shouldn't they all be in the list? And I think it's an important question. And I have to tell you that last year, State Department wanted to include big tech companies, China's big technology companies in this list, but there were some pushback. They couldn't include them. So, all these companies like Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, JD.com, they're not included in the ban list.
Let's jump to a couple of questions here from the audience. One of them is, and I think this kind of might be referring a little bit to what you were talking about earlier, but what about China using shell companies inside the U.S.? So we know that certainly was being done during the China hustle, but what about today?
It's a good question, and I think that's why that this list needs to be updated constantly. And I raised this question before for Commerce Department entity list. What if they use shell companies, to avoid sanctions? So the Commerce Department has another list too, right? So they have entity list. It's I think more than 200 companies are in Chinese companies. More than 200 Chinese companies are in this list. That list basically bans U.S. companies exporting their technology to the Chinese companies. And if you want to export your technology, you need to get licensed. So this is the ban that we have in Commerce Department. And basically what they have to do is constantly research and find out if they are hiding or, if they're using shell companies or others. So this is as the requirement. So they have to be actively updating the list. Finding out these bad actors.
I've got another question here, and I don't know if you have some specific intel on this because it's quite specific, but let's give it a shot. What is Washington going to do to fix the food supply monopolies owned by China operating in the U.S.? I'm guessing that the user is interested in Smithfields and companies of this nature.
It's a great question. I haven't been following this problem, but there's 100 days of review process with the Biden administration launched, and they are basically looking at supply chains at the moment, and they said that they will take action after the review process. At the moment, I don't think it includes the food supply chains, but there are discussions about what to do about, in general, how to expand these choke points and, find out more choke points in other supply chains as well. I think what they want to do is eventually come up with idea of either, increasing U.S. ownership of the production here in the United States, and also expand, a partnership with other countries and secure supply chains in other countries that are aligned with U.S. Foreign policy, like Taiwan, for example. So at the end, I don't know what the outcome will be, but they are reviewing the supply chains at the moment.
So, basically, let's say over the last four years, have we seen any of these supply chains, returning, or even a portion of them at this point?
In the last 4 years, you said?
Yeah.
Well, I can talk about one, which is great, which is the chip, right? So semiconductors, which we are seeing at the moment, the biggest shortage. One company, which is the biggest one in Taiwan, is TSMC, is investing in Arizona. So they're bringing production here. Yes, we have seen production coming to the United States. And I think it started not just because of supply chain problems, but because of tax reform, because of deregulation. That started with the previous administration. So that brought manufacturing to the United States. But people ask me whether this decoupling can really happen. It's so hard, right? This whole supply chains are so integrated. I was just listening to one industry expert. For example, Apple has hundreds of suppliers in China and Taiwan. If you want to bring production to the United States, you need to bring the ecosystem here. Building ecosystem in the United States is so difficult. So it really requires a lot of strategy. And so that's what the companies are battling with. They want to get out of China, but they also know that it's very hard to get out of China. So I think baby steps are important here in this process.
Well, so, would you say that this is one form of the Chinese Communist Party's, unrestricted warfare, basically by having integrated itself so, deeply, I guess, into the whole, basic global economy, and in a way that it makes it very hard to decouple?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this was in the speech of Chinese leader Xi. He made it very clear. He said that we want to be less dependent in global supply chains, But we want global supply chains to be dependent on China. So that's the strategy, and it's very clear. And that's the strategy they have been working on. And just another strategy, I think people may want to know this whole, why PLA companies? Well, basically, companies, there is a strategy in China, which is, we didn't mention, military-civil fusion. This is the strategy. And every company in China has to help PLA. That's the part. So that this is the big strategy. So if you have a technology, you need to share with the Chinese military. And that's the whole strategy they have.
Yeah, and that's just, I'll use the word, wild when you think about it, right? You can imagine it in an American context where, like every company at the behest of the government must collaborate with the U.S. military. Imagine that type of thing, trying to be implemented here.
Absolutely. It's unbelievable.
Let's talk a little bit. You mentioned, Taiwan chip makers, and of course, this is something that very interesting that I think a lot of people don't know is how, the sort of cutting edge chip makers are basically all in Taiwan. I think Taiwan, basically creates most of these, sort of next generation chips and so forth. So it's interesting to see that some of that manufacturing is actually coming to the U.S. And at the same time, we are hearing a ton about, basically China overflights, China naval exercises outside of Taiwan, this sort of, potential Chinese threat on Taiwan. This is a big discussion that's being had right now, and I'm hearing a lot of chatter about this from that. A lot of people, Taiwan experts, are very, very concerned that the mainland China is going to sort of make a move on Taiwan, and what would be the implications of something like that?
Yes, the concern is big. It's not just Taiwan experts or the companies are aware of this big risk. What's happening in, the tension between China and Taiwan. Taiwan is a big hub for semiconductor chips. And not just semiconductor chips, it's actually producing I think something like 80% of high-end chip production. Taiwan is very advanced in manufacturing these advanced chips. And I read in one magazine that it says U.S. is like a year behind Taiwan. So Taiwan is very advanced. And U.S. companies cannot handle the risk of Taiwan being invaded by China. And that's like a disaster for all of them because they are reliant on Taiwan. And this global chip shortage for automakers actually showed how much Taiwan is important for Western companies. The independence of Taiwan is important for Western companies. It's a big concern. And as a matter of fact, The Economist magazine on its May cover said Taiwan is the most dangerous place on earth. So it might be exaggeration, but they are referring to this problem, like how it's so important for the business world. And if there is a disruption in manufacturing of chips, all the companies here that rely on Taiwan will have a big trouble.
Well, I'll just make a little note here. I was recently speaking with Lara. She is a China human rights activist for over a decade. And we were talking, we just passed the Tiananmen Square massacre anniversary on June 4th. And, one of the things she reminded me of is that so many Chinese dissidents and prisoners of conscience and so forth have told me this kind of same idea, what is happening to us is actually something that's going to happen to you too. Don't think that this is something that's so far away. And, and of course, I posted a picture, a series of pictures of the difference, for example, of the Tiananmen Square massacre vigil, commemorations starting in 1990 in Hong Kong, where they were massive. They were massive every year until 2019. And then in 2020, we know Hong Kong has been transformed, freedom has been taken away. There's very few people, and this year, basically almost none, a few people symbolically outside, trying to commemorate this. But the CCP is definitely flexing its muscles, and certainly by proxy. And it's not, in Taiwan, it might seem very far away, but basically what you were just saying reminded me that it's not that far away from the perspective of basically manufacturing of some very, very important technology that's central to how the U.S. and many other countries in the world operate. Emel, given all these realities, okay, so there's sort of a bit of an attempt at decoupling. Seems like it hasn't been terribly effective. There is, basically companies that are being put on ban lists that are, but perhaps not enough yet. And there's the CCP basically saying, there's these Belt and Road initiatives, of course, so there's debt trap diplomacy that they've been using across the world. What can actual American companies do in the face of the current reality that they're facing?
Well, actually, this is a great question. So with this whole, crackdown that started during Trump period, the last year of Trump administration, and now it's continuing, the public awareness increased about, Chinese companies. So they're basically, you mentioned Taiwan, for example, 2 companies are helping Chinese Communist Party in the South China Sea, like the aviation company, you have the China shipbuilding company, and American investors are basically helping these companies by funding them, by basically investing in their stocks. And they do it unknowingly. That's the problem, right? So what they do now is that they're calling their stockbrokers, they're calling their fund managers saying, how much exposure do I have to Chinese stocks? How much risk do I have? And that puts pressure on fund managers. And then fund managers call index providers. And so if the index providers get feedback from fund managers. So I think this whole thing has transformed, and there will be more and more companies dropping from these indexes and dropping from the New York Stock Exchange. And this is, I think that's what we're going to see. And one thing that I want to say as well, I forgot to mention, this is a bipartisan issue in Washington. And what they done I think in December, Congress passed a bill, which is called Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. This was passed and was signed into law by Trump. What it requires is that it wants all companies, foreign companies, to be basically in line with U.S. regulations, U.S. accounting rules. If they are listed in the United States, if they cannot comply with these rules for 3 consecutive years, they will be delisted. So it's a good step. You may say, why 3 years? Why can't we do it in just 1 year? That's a good question. I don't know. But we are seeing that happening, and this is good too. So if you're not in the ban list, if the company is not in the ban list, if they are traded in the U.S. stock exchanges, they have the risk of being delisted if they cannot comply with U.S. accounting rules and U.S. laws and U.S. regulations. So that's a good step.
Well, I mean, just basic common sense, it would seem, right? Basically have to live by the rules that everyone else has to live by.
Exactly. And this is basically, leveling the play field for American companies. So they have been suffering from this mistreatment for the Chinese companies. So why Microsoft is treated differently than, Alibaba? So can investors really rely on the numbers of Alibaba? That's a good question. But will this resolve all the questions? I don't know. Like, it's a good question to ask as well. Like, will we see, some problems to continue, like audit reports, for example? I don't know. This is a good question to raise, but at least, there are important steps to basically eliminate this discrimination.
Emel, any final thoughts before we finish up here?
Well, Beyond, thanks for having me. I think this is an issue, and I think it's really interesting to see with the Biden administration that the whole, investing in Chinese companies are being basically, these Chinese companies are being, tracked, and U.S. investors are protected from investing in these companies. So I think it's important to see for human rights advocates, for national security policymakers, to see that there is this continuation of the policy made during the Trump era, and so it's continuing. So the crackdown is there. The next step is basically for the Treasury Department to identify and expand this list, and there will be rulemaking as well. So we will have to watch and see the next steps, and so it's hard to know what will happen. But I think it's a good development to see that there is more control over these Chinese companies invested by the American investors.
Well, Emel, it was really, really great to have you on. And I just wanted to remind everyone that in just under an hour, I guess almost exactly an hour, we're going to have the New American Thought Leaders episode with Dr. Nicole Saphier. Dr. Nicole Saphier wrote the book COVID Panic. And we talk about all sorts of things related to the Wuhan lab leak theory, the Wuhan lab, the realities, but also the realities of how various aspects of the pandemic were dealt with in the U.S. and essentially some of the panic that was created and what it perpetuated. It's a really fascinating interview. I hope you join us. And finally, I would invite everyone to come watch our New American Thought Leaders special documentary, DeSantis, Florida versus Lockdowns. We'll see you next time.